Welcome to episode 201 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. Each week we walk you through the Epicurean text and we discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at epicureanfriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. Last week we had our 200th anniversary recap, retrospective discussion of future plans episode. I think it was a very good episode. We'll probably suggest people in the future come back to episode 200 to get an orientation to the podcast when they first start listening to it. When we broke off on episode 200, we were in the middle of book 2 of Cicero's Own Ends. We are going to begin today around section 9. If you're following in the Read edition, it's around page 41. And we are in the beginning of a very long argument by Cicero against Epicurus. And Torquatus does not get much opportunity to reply as we go through these sections. In reviewing for today, the arguments that Cicero is bringing up are complicated. They're difficult to read to some extent without keeping the big picture of what he's doing in mind. And as we go through these next several episodes, we're going to bring our best abilities to the task of making this interesting. And I do think it is. There's a lot of material buried in here because Cicero, even as he's attacking Epicurus, is constantly quoting Epicurus. And so you get an additional perspective on some very familiar doctrines and sections of letters of Epicurus that Cicero is quoting. And he's interpreting them in negative ways that he feels make the philosophy vulnerable. But this is going to give us a lot of good experience in different ways to interpret Epicurus and how to do so sympathetically as opposed to negatively as Cicero is doing. We're starting off today in section 9. What we found for the last several weeks is a lot of his argument is a sort of a vocabulary criticism, that Epicurus is using the word pleasure more broadly than he should be, and that normal people do not use the word pleasure to describe anything but stimulating and active experiences in life, whereas Epicurus is using the word much more broadly to include not only those stimulating and active experiences of pleasure, but also more normal experiences of daily life, which aren't stimulating, but which we would still consider to be pleasurable for a variety of reasons. So Cicero is taking a position that you're talking about two separate things, Epicurus. You should not refer to two separate things with only one word. And I don't know about our listeners, but those kind of arguments have never impressed me very much. And I don't know that they're going to sway the opinions of most readers here that, oh, we should throw Epicurus out because he's using the word in a somewhat different way. Once you understand the way that Epicurus is using the word and see his reasoning for it, most of those problems go away. In the words that DeWitt used, these kind of arguments are captious and harping on details that don't need to be harped on. Phrasing choices that are in fact discretionary and not, of course, handed down by God or in some way absolutely wrong that he should be doing this. He's got his reasons for it and they make a lot of sense. And as DeWitt says, people would be better off if they thought that way and applied that perspective to their own lives. Today, in the beginning of section 9, he's coming to the famous words of Epicurus about dividing the desires down into natural, necessary, unnatural, unnecessary. He quotes Epicurus saying that there are three kinds of passions, one natural and necessary, another natural but not necessary, and a third neither natural nor necessary. And Cicero says, in the first place, this subdivision lacks neatness. It's not neat. For he has made what were really two classes into three. This is not to subdivide, but to rend asunder. So previously he's criticizing Epicurus for considering two things within one word, and now he's saying that this subdivision takes two and makes them three.
Yeah, Cassius, this is Cicero at his most nitpicky and most insufferable, isn't it? When he's like, well, you're confusing a species with a genus, right? That what Epicurus should have done was say that desires are either natural or necessary, so you have two genuses, and then of the natural kind, some are necessary and some are unnecessary. And that's your species level. Cicero is pretending that this is far more important than it really is. And we're going to be dealing with a lot of sort of meaningless, mindless word games like this. Now, I found a source. His name is Aulus Gellius. He was a 2nd century grammarian, and he's responding in this text, which is called Attic Nights. He's responding to Plutarch, and specifically, he's responding in this section of the text to Plutarch's criticisms of Epicurus. And it's a few paragraphs, but I'm going to read it. I think it gives us a good insight into the fact that even in the ancient world, there were people who were looking at some of these criticisms and going, you're just crazy. This is insane that you're harping on these things that are not only so secondary and minute in importance that it's ridiculous to be spending so much time on them, but to assume that Epicurus didn't know that natural and necessary was a subset of natural, and that natural and unnecessary was a subset of unnecessary, and so forth. It's ridiculous. So anyway, this is Aulus Gellius writing in the 2nd century. He was educated in Athens, but lived in Rome, and he starts this way. Plutarch, in the 2nd book of his essay on Homer, asserts that Epicurus made use of an incomplete, perverted, and faulty syllogism, and he quotes Epicurus's own words. Death is nothing to us, for what is dissolved is without perception, and what is without perception is nothing to us. Now, Epicurus, says Plutarch, omitted what he ought to have stated as his major premise, that death is a dissolution of body and soul. And then, to prove something else, he goes on to use the very premise that he had omitted as if it had been stated and conceded. But this syllogism, says Plutarch, cannot advance unless that premise be first presented. And then Aulus Gellius responds, what Plutarch wrote as to the form and sequence of a syllogism is true enough. For if you wish to argue and reason according to the teaching of the schools, you ought to say, death is the dissolution of soul and body. What is dissolved is without perception, and what is without perception is nothing to us. But we cannot suppose that Epicurus, being the man he was, omitted that part of the syllogism through ignorance, or that it was his intention to state a syllogism complete in all its members and limitations, as is done in the schools of the logicians. But since the separation of body and soul by death is self-evident, he, of course, did not think it necessary to call attention to what was perfectly obvious to everyone. For the same reason, too, he put the conclusion of the syllogism not at the end, but at the beginning. Who does not see that this also was not due to inadvertence? These people, Plutarch and Cicero, they want to make Epicurus seem like the country bumpkin from the provinces who has come to Athens and is talking about philosophy with a total ignorance of the Greek language and of logic, and has no business at all engaged on the turf of Plato and Aristotle. And it's absurd. But the important part is coming up here in the next paragraph, where Aulus Gellius says, in the same book, Plutarch also finds fault a second time with Epicurus for using an inappropriate word and giving it an incorrect meaning. Now, Epicurus wrote as follows, the utmost height of pleasure is the removal of everything that pains. Plutarch declares that he ought not to have said of everything that pains, but of everything that is painful. For it is the removal of pain, he explains, that should be indicated, not of that which causes pain. In bringing this charge against Epicurus, Plutarch is word-chasing with excessive minuteness and almost with frigidity. For far from hunting up such verbal meticulousness and such refinements of diction, Epicurus hunts them down. And the footnote by the translator of that last part is implying that Epicurus deliberately eliminates them, this furor over syllogisms and correct forms of diction, right? That people know what we're talking about. We don't need to go on and on about this stuff, as Cicero is doing here. People are not confused, as Cicero is pretending to be confused for 5 pages about Epicurus including lack of pain as a kind of pleasure, right? People get this. We don't have to continually bang the drum about Epicurus's ignorance on this question. But that's exactly what Cicero is going to do, and it's exactly what Plutarch does after Cicero. So I thought that Attic Nights by Aulus Gellius, as I said, a 2nd century Roman grammarian, is able very quickly there to get to the point, and I think it's an excellent point, that this verbal sparring over meaningless distinctions and categories and subdivisions is not productive.
Yeah, that's extremely helpful, Joshua. And that's what we're in the middle of now. We're going to flip back and forth between these hyper-technical grammarian criticisms and on syllogisms and then more substantive arguments. But that's what Cicero starts out with. And in fact, the specific example that you've raised there about death is nothing to us, I believe we are going to come to that later in this section of Book 2. Where we are now is probably the second example of it. He started out with the issue with the word pleasure. Now he's talking about the issues with the natural and necessary division. And in the middle of all those grammarian criticisms, he's going to throw in a lot of, you're despicable to even take these positions. So he goes back and forth between his different types of arguments. I think we probably covered the natural and necessary part there. He sort of does the same thing in regard to talking about limiting passion as well. He says that, to my mind, this is exactly what's not very satisfactory with the philosopher who talks about limiting the passions. Can a passion be limited, Cicero says? It's rather a thing to abolish and drag out by the roots. You don't want to limit passion. You want to eradicate it, according to Cicero. And so he's, again, criticizing the use of a perspective by Epicurus that everybody knows what you're talking about, that you don't want to just drag out by the roots all desire from your life, but you want to prudently choose and pursue your desires. Everybody understands that. And to talk about limiting passions is not a nonsensical way of talking about the subject. I think we mentioned this actually 2 weeks ago. This is the section where Cicero says, what sort of philosophy is this which does not lead to the extinction of depravity, but is satisfied with moderation in sin? That's the argument that Frances Wright uses in her confrontation between Epicurus and Zeno. Frances Wright singled this out as a particularly important thing for people to understand. And she has Epicurus say that if this were true, this would destroy the philosophy. But it's not true from the Epicurean perspective that you're being satisfied with moderation in sin. It's a reality of life that you're going to be confronted with pain and with pleasure in your life, and that you're going to do your best to pursue the pleasure and avoid the pain. This is the point that Martin raised at the end of our episode 200, that just because you can't be perfectly in a state of pleasure does not mean that you can't experience a dominance of pleasure over pain in your life. You're not happy about the fact that some pain is involved, but you're willing to choose pain, for example, in certain situations so as to get a greater pleasure later on. That doesn't mean you're happy to choose the pain, but it means that it's worthwhile to do and you're going to do it in order to live a better life. These are ways of explaining things that are not rocket science and not difficult to understand, and yet Cicero's approaching all this as if Epicurus is saying we should be satisfied with moderation in sin.
Right. Now, another source I was looking at last night was the categories of Aristotle, in which he's breaking down things that can be said to be subjects and things that are predicable of subjects, right? He's got 10 sort of categories of what is predicable of a subject, and he points to things like location, duration, and so forth, possessing something else, being possessed by something else, on and on about it. And I think Cicero has certainly read this text. And so it's amazing to me that Cicero continues to fail to understand that there is a difference between things that are productive of pleasure and pleasure. And it didn't even occur to me to put it in these terms, but Aristotle is so clear on this point that in this case, pleasure would be the subject, and things which are predicable of pleasure are things that are productive of pleasure. That would be the predicate in that sentence, right? And so it's not that Cicero doesn't understand this, but he finds that there is great utility in prying and picking at this apparently loose end. But I don't think there is a loose end. There is a difference between the feeling of pleasure and things that stimulate the feeling of pleasure, or things that are productive of the feeling of pleasure, like absence of pain. But like I said, it's absolutely infuriating that Cicero goes on and on and on about this. It's actually a very simple thing to understand.
Joshua, that reminds me, one phrase that stuck with me for years from DeWitt. There's an essay that came out in the early 1900s. I think the name of the writer, Mary Porter Packer or something like that. But she wrote an article called Cicero's Presentation of Epicurean Ethics. And she goes through book 1 and book 2 and talks about where Cicero is accurate and not accurate and so forth. And what DeWitt's comment was, he said it was generally a good essay to read, but his comment was that the main disagreement he had with Mary Porter Packer was that she acquitted Cicero of the charge of intentionally misrepresenting Epicurus. And DeWitt's phrase was to the effect that The only reason Cicero was able to misrepresent Epicurus with such effect is that he understood Epicurus so well. And that leads you to the conclusion that he was misrepresenting. I don't think Cicero just fails to understand the argument. He understands what Epicurus is saying, and he disagrees with the result. And what he's doing in expressing his disagreement is that he just was a muddy thinker. He's maybe giving the Epicureans an out. I made a comment about this earlier, that to some extent it's interesting to me how friendly this discussion between Cicero and Torquatus is, because Cicero never attacks Torquatus's character. He's always praising Torquatus and Torquatus's ancestors, and he's using that as his real argument. You're such a good person, Torquatus. You can't really believe these things that Epicurus is saying. But the point is that Torquatus does believe it, and Cicero understands it but disagrees with it. And like I say, probably using an argumentative technique where he's trying to cozy up to Torquatus and cozy up to the Epicureans. In fact, there's another comment we'll get to later on where Cicero goes on again about how vast numbers, I think he says, of people were following Epicurus and had a lot of power, I think was his comment. So Cicero was realizing that a lot of people thought these were good arguments. And so he couldn't just say, you're an idiot, Torquatus, you're stupid, Cassius. He's saying in a kind and oozing way as a lawyer that you just need to read this and understand that Epicurus is not stating these things clearly, and he's leading you down a false path that you yourself, who are such a good person, would never follow if you really understood what Epicurus was saying.
Yeah, Cassius, I was reading one of Cicero's defense orations when he was working as a defense attorney for a guy named Gnaeus Plancius in this essay called Pro Plancio. And it's exactly like that. It's this sort of unctuous, the defendant is a man of integrity and honor, but the plaintiff is a guy of distinction and family record and humility and so forth. It goes on and on about that. And you're right that this is kind of a gnawing and annoying way to go about this. And I've experienced this myself by people who will say things like, oh, you're far too smart to believe that everything around us happened by chance, right?
Yes.
You have to understand that this was God who did this. And I know if you just thought about it for a little bit, you're smart enough that you would figure this out. It's absolutely infuriating to be on the receiving end of this treatment.
Now, he continues on this kind of analysis, talking now about the word passion. And he's talking about Epicurus' type of pleasure, a depravity. Let him call these feelings the cravings of nature. Let him keep the term passion for another use, so that when he comes to speak of miserliness, self-indulgence, and the greatest sins, he may arraign the term, so to speak, on a capital charge. But he states these doctrines with greater freedom, not unfrequently. But owing to the fact that he seems often to embrace ardently the pleasure which all nations denote by the term, the active and stimulating pleasures, he sometimes is involved in great straits, so much so that there is nothing so disreputable that he does not seem likely to do it for the sake of pleasure, if only he is secure from the cognizance of his fellow men. Then blushing, for the force of nature is very great, he makes his escape in this way, by denying that any addition can be made to the pleasure felt by one who is free from pain. This is going to take us back into this complicated and extremely important issue of freedom from pain, but talking about this is going to be very helpful. Cicero says, but this condition of freedom from pain is not called pleasure. I'm not anxious about terms, says Epicurus, but how if the thing signified is entirely different? And he seems to be quoting Epicurus here as a figurative response. He has Epicurus say, I shall find many persons, or rather persons without number, who are not so pedantic or troublesome as you are, and such that I may easily win them over to any doctrine I choose. Cicero continues, why then do we hesitate to say, if absence of pain be the highest pleasure, that to be without pleasure is the intensest pain? Why does not this hold good, as I put it? And he has Epicurus figuratively say, because pain has for its opposite not pleasure, but the removal of pain. Okay, so what we need to talk about is, going back to this issue of freedom from pain, Cicero is accusing Epicurus of denying that there's any addition that can be made to the pleasure felt by one who is free from pain. But he says Epicurus doesn't consider this freedom from pain to be pleasure. Now, I think we have to unwind that by going back to what we talked about last week. that Epicurus does consider the condition of freedom of pain to be pleasure. And you end up with this argument being another example of Cicero refusing to accept Epicurus's terms and making it seem to be contradictory.
Let me go back to this depravity issue for just a moment. Cicero is making the claim. He almost outright calls Epicurus a pervert here. I mean, that's what he's doing. He makes the claim that because adulterers experience pleasure, then Epicurus is morally justifying adultery. And because profligates and sybarites experience pleasure, then Epicurus is morally justifying adultery. And that the desire that causes us to pursue pleasure needs to be ripped out by the roots, because it is associated with things like adultery and profligacy and so forth. But Cicero would never say that the public road system in ancient Rome was bad and needed to be ripped up from the roadbeds because robbers and highwaymen and unsavory types also use roads. You see what I'm saying there? You wouldn't make that argument. Cicero wouldn't make that argument. You wouldn't say that, well, we can't have aqueducts because that's going to give water to people who are going to murder or rape. It's the same kind of thing. Pleasure needs to be judged on its own terms. You cannot drag in all of these other issues related to depravity as a way to judge pleasure. I don't think that's fair. And when you put it in other terms, it's obvious that it's not fair. But back to this is at the bottom of page 42 is what you're talking about.
Yes.
And I can just quote it again. He says, "Why then do we hesitate to say, if absence of pain be the highest pleasure, that to be without pleasure is the intensest pain?" Well, when I read that, what I immediately thought of was a passage from a book called On Ends by Cicero. This is book 1, section 12 of book 1. This is Torquatus giving us sort of the exemplar of the life of pleasure. He says, "Let us imagine a man living in the continuous enjoyment of numerous and vivid pleasures alike of body and of mind, undisturbed either by the presence or by the prospect of pain. What possible state of existence could we describe as being more excellent or more desirable? One so situated must possess in the first place a strength of mind that is proof against all fear of death or of pain. He will know that death means complete unconsciousness, and that pain is generally light if long and short if strong, so that its intensity is compensated by brief duration and its continuance by diminishing severity. Let such a man, moreover, have no dread of any supernatural power. Let him never suffer the pleasures of the past to fade away, but constantly renew their enjoyment and recollection, and his lot will be one which will not admit of further improvement." Now, the difference between what Torquatus is saying in book 1 and what Cicero is demanding of Epicurus in book 2 is that what Torquatus says in book 1 is a much more complete definition of pleasure, a much more complete understanding of the word pleasure. It includes not fearing the problems associated with death. It includes not fearing supernatural gods. It includes the memory of past pleasures and the anticipation of future pleasures. And so when Cicero says, as he says there at the bottom of page 42, "Why then do we hesitate to say, if absence of pain be the highest pleasure, that to be without pleasure is the intensest pain?" Well, Torquatus doesn't really hesitate to say that, because his next paragraph there in book 1 is this: "Suppose, on the other hand, a person crushed beneath the heaviest load of mental and of bodily anguish to which humanity is liable. Grant him no hope of ultimate relief in view. Also give him no pleasure, either present or in prospect. Can one describe or imagine a more pitiable state? If then a life full of pain is the thing most to be avoided, it follows that to live in pain is the highest evil, and this position implies that a life of pleasure is the ultimate good. In fact, the mind possesses nothing in itself upon which it can rest as final. Every fear, every sorrow can be traced back to pain. There is no other thing besides pain which is of its own nature capable of causing either anxiety or distress." So if you go through what Torquatus says, a man living in the continuous enjoyment of numerous and vivid pleasures alike of body and of mind, and on, if you were to just reverse every claim there and say that he's living in the continuous suffering of numerous and vivid pains alike of body and of mind, I don't think that's actually far off from being a good answer to what Cicero is demanding here in book 2. That to be completely, comprehensively, and entirely without pleasure is to be in a state of horrible pain.
Joshua, that's why we pay you so much to be on this podcast with us. That's a brilliant exposition. I did not think of that, but I think that's an excellent answer to this. This goes back to DeWitt's comment. Cicero is misrepresenting things and misrepresenting to some extent what he's reported himself in Book 1 from Torquatus, because I think you're right. That passage you just quoted does amount to saying exactly that to be without pleasure, without hope of pleasure, without any ability to change that condition is the worst condition you can be in, which would be, in these words, the intensest pain here. Cicero knows that these logical deductions that you've just drawn are there, and yet he refuses to draw them himself, and he acts as if nobody in their right mind could draw them. And it all comes back to this idea that pleasure is not limited to sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It's not limited to these stimulating activities that everybody understands to be pleasure. But everybody also understands that good feelings about other people, benevolence, reading literature, listening to poetry, looking at art, just reflecting on the good feelings about your friends and your family and the experiences of your past. You don't have to be constantly in a state of stimulated action in order to experience pleasure. And everybody does know that. But in the hands of a good lawyer like Cicero, you can tend to forget things like that and say, oh, yeah, Cicero, you're right. This man's not being stimulated by listening to this discussion. And that's where this third state comes in. It's easier to argue not that they're in pain when they're not in pleasure. It's easier to argue that someone who's not being stimulated is just simply in a neutral state. And that's the importance of this neutral state issue, is that when you understand that when you're not in pain, you are lucky to be alive, you're experiencing pleasure, then you don't run into that logical hurdle that Cicero is trying to throw up here. And it becomes apparent what Epicurus is trying to do. Cicero is trying to say that Epicurus's position is that the opposite of pain is not pleasure, but absence of pain. And Epicurus could use those words, but when you understand the absence of pain to be pleasure, there's no contradiction because you're saying the same thing. In fact, that's the difference between Rackham and Reed. Reed's words are exactly this. Quote, because pain has for its opposite not pleasure, but the removal of pain. Now, Rackham translates that as because the opposite of pain is not pleasure, but absence of pain. I think either way you translate it, you come up to the same result. Epicurus said in the letter to Menoikeus, by pleasure we mean the absence of pain. I think it's very reasonable to reverse that and say by absence of pain we mean pleasure. Epicurus is using these concepts interchangeably. And in this last sentence here, what Cicero is doing is he's refusing once again to accept the interchangeability of removal of pain as pleasure. So I think the probable best way to interpret all this is that if Torquatus were allowed to answer here, he would be going back to this same point that Epicurus said that absence of pain is pleasure. If you say absence of pain is pleasure, that means pleasure is absence of pain. And you can use those terms interchangeably. And so we don't hesitate to say that if absence of pain is the highest pleasure, then to be without pleasure is the intensest pain. We would say that. Just like 100% pleasure, pure pleasure is the height of pleasure. If you don't have any pleasure, that means you've got 100% pain. I don't think there's any problem with saying 100% pain is the highest pain.
That's a very good point.
It's interesting to think it through. There's no doubt it deserves a lot of thought to put it in exactly the right words. It's this tension that we constantly run into. If 100% pleasure is the most intense pleasure, okay, that makes sense logically. You can't get any more pleasurable than 100% pleasure. But because we haven't stated what exactly you're doing in that type of pleasure, it's natural to ask the question, well, are you saying that I can be 100% pleasure by cutting my fingernails, or I can be 100% pleasure by having sex, drugs, and rock and roll? Okay, I think I'll take 100% sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And you've got to keep those questions in perspective that 100% pleasure isn't telling you exactly what you're doing. It's just simply telling you that you've got 100% pleasure and it's not going to get any more than 100%. I think the same analysis would apply to 100% pain. The type of experience you're undergoing is going to be different depending on the experience, but it will never be more than 100%.
Yeah, that's Aristotle's difference between the subject and the predicate, right? That pleasure as a feeling, pain as a feeling, those are the subjects, but the predicate of all of the surrounding detail is and can be different in different circumstances, but that doesn't change what the feeling is.
Right. We all know that we can be eating bread and water, or we could be eating the best food at a great banquet. We're receiving pleasure from both. The type of pleasure is different, but they're both legitimately called pleasure.
So now we get to section 10 here, and Cicero starts off with character assassination. He says, "Now, not to see that the greatest proof we have with regard to that form of pleasure apart from which he declares himself wholly unable to understand the nature of good," parentheses, he pursues this pleasure into detail thus, "that which we enjoy through the palate, through the ears," and then he adds the rest. And Cicero, clutching his pearls, says, "Things not to be named without an apologetic preface." By the way, this sentence is very, very difficult and intricate grammatically. "Very well," says Cicero, "this stern and serious philosopher does not see that the only good within his knowledge is a thing not even to be desired, because on the authority of the same thinker, whenever we are without pain, we do not crave that form of pleasure." He's talking about sex here, basically. I could find the quote here. This is from a text by Epicurus, which we don't have. It's called On the End Goal, or On Ends, again, just like Cicero's book. And Epicurus says, "For I at least do not even know what I should conceive the good to be if I eliminate the pleasures of taste, and eliminate the pleasures of sex, and eliminate the pleasures of listening, and eliminate the pleasant motions caused in our vision by a visible or beautiful form." And the simple answer here to Cicero's problem is that while absence of pain is a kind of pleasure, it is, once again, for the 100th time, not the fullest possible exposition of pleasure. Yes, pleasure includes food. I should say the pleasure includes the pleasure we get from food. It includes the pleasure we get from sex. It includes the pleasure we get from listening to music or going to the theater. It includes the pleasure we get from watching people dance, or whatever the reference is there to forms. And it's only because Cicero is, as Norman DeWitt says, making a big to-do about this, that he is unwilling to understand this simple fact. And it's absolutely infuriating. Now, I had to go and look up this story. I'd heard this story before. I'd never actually read the text. And I should preface this by saying that bear in mind that in this oration that I'm reading from Cicero, this pro plancio oration, he is a defense attorney, and there are requirements to that job that should not be overlooked. But if you're going to say to Epicurus that the pleasures that he's describing, the pleasures of sex, that you can't even mention that in company without an apologetic preface, I have to quote this from this oration pro plancio. Cicero says, "And would you," meaning the attorney for the plaintiff, by the way, Gnaeus Plancius in this case is being accused of bribery in an election, and the guy who lost the election is taking him to court, and Cicero is defending this guy. And he says, "Would you dim with your silly insinuations the luster of that untarnished life? You hint darkly at acts of immorality, charges which cannot even be suspected, far less substantiated against him. Not content with inventing charges, you invent names for your charges and call him a bigamist. You say that he took with him to the province a companion to be the instrument of his base passions. This statement is not a charge, but a reckless and libelous falsehood. You say that he raped a ballet girl. We hear that this crime was once committed at Atina by a band of youths who took advantage of an old privilege allowed at the scenic games, especially in country towns. What a tribute to the propriety of my client's youthful days. He is reproached with an act which he was permitted by privilege to commit." So this is, again, he's a defense attorney, but he's defending here an act of rape. Apparently the girl was 12 years old. And he says that this is a tribute to the propriety of his client's youthful days. I think we have many analogs in the modern world for this kind of thing. But I only bring it up because of what Cicero is accusing Epicurus of doing here. He says in that preceding section, section 9, he says that Epicurus would do anything for pleasure if only he had assurance that he wouldn't be caught by his fellow men, right? And if you're going to make that accusation, I think it's only fair to include what other things Cicero has said on this subject. So he's pretending here to clutch his pearls at the mention of sex, as if to make Epicurus out to be a pervert on the subject. But this is absolutely baseless, and it is beneath the dignity, I think, of someone arguing his point in this case. And like Diogenes Laertius says, we have innumerable evidence that Epicurus was a kind and gentle person. I think even later in this text that Cicero says himself that is true. So I find this thing absolutely infuriating.
Yeah, these character assassination accusations are a major theme of everything that Cicero is doing here. Before we move on, however, to the next example of character assassination, let me point out this, that the part that he ends this section on that, Joshua, you read earlier, the part about, very well, this stern and serious philosopher does not see that the only good within his knowledge is a thing not even to be desired, because on the authority of the same thinker, whenever we are without pain, we do not crave that form of pleasure. I think that is probably a direct reference to what we have in section 128 of the letter to Menorchius. Let me quote that. The right understanding of these facts enables us to refer all choice and avoidance to the health of the body and the soul's freedom from disturbance, since this is the aim of the life of blessedness. For it's to obtain this end that we always act, namely to avoid pain and fear. And when this is once secured for us, all the tempest of the soul is dispersed, since the living creature has not to wander as though in search of something that's missing, and to look for some other thing by which he can fulfill the good of the soul and the good of the body. For it is then that we have need of pleasure, when we feel pain owing to the absence of pleasure. But when we do not feel pain, we no longer need pleasure. And that's a line that people talk about a lot in discussing Epicurus in general. And I think that's what Cicero is saying here when he says, quote, on the authority of the same thinker, whenever we are without pain, we do not crave that form of pleasure. As Cicero says, how irreconcilable these statements are. So we should reconcile them before we move on. What is this about an allegation that when we do not feel pain, we no longer need pleasure? In what ways can we say, Cicero, you're an idiot? You don't need further explanation. But here, I'll explain it to you anyway, Cicero.
Well, I think it's obvious, Cassius, that to say that when we no longer have the craving for pleasure, that we don't need that pleasure. I mean, when you no longer have the craving of thirst, you no longer experience thirst, right? One thing we should say about what Torquatus says about the ideal life, what Epicurus says about the ideal life, is that no one said this is going to be easy or it's going to come naturally to you, right? The study of philosophy for Epicurus is easy and brings pleasure with it. But this life that Epicurus compares to the life of the gods is not something that you're going to experience every moment of your life. We are plagued by cravings, and sometimes the best thing to do is to satisfy those cravings. So I think just by definition, to be without pain in the most perfect sense of that is to also be without the craving for food, the craving for water, the craving for sex. I mean, just by definition.
I think I will go further too, though, and add on to what you just said, that it's interesting to me that you don't want to put too much emphasis on a particular translation and a particular word, but at least in the translation from Bailey that I read, Bailey translates Epicurus as saying, when we do not feel pain, we no longer need pleasure. I think you can also look at that from the point of view of when we don't feel pain, that means we are at 100% pleasure and we don't need anything more than 100% because we frankly can't have anything more than 100%. You can look at it from that direction as well. But in Cicero's wording of it, Reed says that when we are without pain, we do not crave that form of pleasure. Rackham says we feel no need of this sort of pleasure so long as we are free from pain. Could be that what Cicero's doing here is, again, the same distinction of what pleasure means. Cicero's trying to say that when you're free from pain, that means you don't need sex. That means you don't need rock and roll. That means you don't need food. You don't need anything. The point is, you don't need any kind of pleasure anymore when you've had 100%. When you're at freedom from pain, you, by definition, you don't have any cravings for additional pleasure because you're full at that point. It's not necessarily tied to the type of pleasure. When Epicurus says, when you're free from pain, you no longer need pleasure, He's meaning when you're free from pain, you've got 100% complete pleasure, so you don't need any more when you're at 100% and when you're complete. And of course, Cicero doesn't explain it from that perspective, and he doesn't let Torquatus come back in and say that either.
Yeah, it's important to understand that the Epicurean texts are very clear that once you've reached the limit of the quantity of pleasure, as he describes in the third principle doctrine, what you're dealing with after that point is variation in pleasure. And while there's
Yes.
nothing at all wrong with pursuing those variations in pleasure, you are at the maximum. I mean, that is Epicurus on pleasure 101.
I'm afraid this is a source of great concern for a lot of people, and I think it leads to major problems. If you take the position that absence of pain means something other than pleasure, then you really do look at this last sentence in section 128 and say, hey, this doesn't make sense at all, because it says when we don't feel pain, we no longer need pleasure. Well, frankly, I thought we need pleasure all the time. What can you possibly be talking about? And if you think absence of pain is some other condition other than pleasure, then this really does cause lots of concern because it doesn't clearly explain what he means. But just as Aulus Gellius, who Joshua was quoting earlier, was taking the position that Epicurus is not so stupid that he has to continuously point out the same thing over and over that is obvious to people. That's what he's doing here. He said over and over and over again that pleasure is the end of life. He said that pleasure includes all of these things that everybody understands to be pleasure and the normal activities of life. He doesn't, every time he used the word pleasure, have to go back into that same explanation again. And especially when you're writing a condensation type of letter where you're trying to be simple and explain your philosophy in a short work, you just are not going to be able to use the same definition over and over and over again. I'm reminded of the situation in Emily Austin's book where she talks about natural but unnecessary desires. And she said, I just can't write that phrase over and over and over again. So she came up with extravagant desires, if I remember correctly. There may be a parallel there in what we're talking about, in that I know Dr. Austin has expressed reservations about that word as whether it completely encapsulates her point. And this may be a similar situation. When you abbreviate, when you condense things down, you have to rely on the intelligence of your reader to remember what you've previously said.
Yeah, that's exactly right. If I said, Cassius, I'm just going to pop into the store to get bread, you wouldn't respond to me saying, well, your syllogism is incomplete. You haven't told me that the store has bread. If you want to write a complete syllogism, then you have to include that as one of your premises. I mean, that is a ridiculous approach to human life. It's farcical, really, that this is the point that Cicero is going to make here. I think you're right to say that Aulus Gellius has absolutely hit the nail on the head with that one.
And if you came back from the grocery store, not only with Sunbeam sliced bread, but also with hot dog buns and hamburger buns, I wouldn't call you a liar and say that you totally misrepresented the reason you went to the store, because you came back with various forms of bread. I wouldn't say that you totally misrepresented your sentence if you come out with something other than a single loaf of bread. But that's the kind of thing that Cicero is doing here when he's taking these very, very nitpicking definitions of words and using them in ways that Epicurus is not using them. Okay, looking at the clock, we're probably going to need to begin to wrap up our episode. And that means we'll come back next week and begin again with section 10. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and take closing thoughts for the day. Martin.
I have nothing to add today. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Martin. Calasini.
During this episode, I've been trying to follow these argument and the rebuttals, and it came to me that perhaps creating some kind of a chart, because I'm sort of visual, if I could almost just see a list of all of this, it would help me, because there's so much going on here. There's so many different threads that we're pulling on and going into, and to be able to kind of create a chart. But also the question is, which of these might a modern person bring up? Like, which kinds of questions are still relevant for people who are unclear about the philosophy now?
I think the majority of what we're talking about is exactly the kind of issue that we continue to deal with. And maybe the most obvious one is that we talk about pleasure as the goal and pleasure as a central aspect of Epicurean philosophy. And many people have very different definitions of what that word pleasure means. And they disagree with using the word pleasure as the goal of life. And I don't think I can think of any more common controversy in discussing Epicurus than that issue. And that is exactly what Cicero is arguing about. Joshua?
I just want to, again, sort of plug this book by Aulus Gellius because I think it's very clear on some of the problems that Cicero and Plutarch, we'll probably have to go through Plutarch eventually, that Cicero and Plutarch are using in their criticism of Epicurus. And it's striking to me because, again, this is the 2nd century. This is the Roman Empire in the 2nd century, that even in the ancient world, people are not immune to seeing clearly through what Cicero is doing here. I find that to be very cheering, actually, that not everybody was taken in by Rome's great orator, that there were people even then who were like, this guy's crazy for what he is demanding of Epicurus in just kind of casual speech. It's ridiculous. And I think it is ridiculous. And to me, that one of the values of going through this is I didn't even realize how bad it was in the 2nd book, Cassius. You've been telling us for weeks now that this was going to be somewhat difficult stuff, but I didn't realize that Cicero was going to stoop to these levels that he is stooping to. Anyway, much more to come. We're on page 43 here. I think this goes on to like page 70 or something, I think. So there's a lot more to cover.
And it's cheering, as you say, to realize that there are ancient authors as well as modern ones who can see through these arguments. But at the same time, it's, of course, sobering to realize that Cicero's position has been the prevailing position for 2,000 years now. Ultimately, though, we can come back and read this material and see through it. And we know that there's been people throughout the ages who have done the same thing. And it's a fascinating and enjoyable thing to do. It's not sex, drugs, and rock and roll in that sense of the word pleasure, but it sure is pleasurable in other ways that lend depth and show what Epicurus was talking about, that you don't limit the word pleasure so narrowly. And of course, what's the big issue anyway behind all this? He's attacking the word pleasure because he wants to substitute virtue, rationalism, some type of theism as the real basis of morality instead of pleasure. So he's pulling out every weapon in his arsenal to discredit Epicurus, and it takes fighting back to be able to defend yourself and understand why Cicero's position is not correct. Okay, with that, we'll close for this week. We'll come back next week. In the meantime, join us at the forum, and we'll talk about this and anything else you'd like to talk about regarding Epicurus. Thanks for your time today. We'll see you next week. Bye.